I would like to begin by acknowledging my respect and deep gratitude to the First Nations peoples of BC, on whose traditional territories we are honored to live, work, and play. In particular, the Musqueam people, on whose traditional territories we are meeting. Have you ever considered what shapes a nation? What aspects of our history and heritage stand out to other nations? Judges, honored guests, and fellow cadets. Today, I'm going to share with you just a small glimpse of the role Indigenous people have played in Canada's heritage. Let me begin by sharing my point of view on the topic. Indigenous people are Canada's heritage. Canada is home to a rich and diverse heritage. The history of the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis is essentially the very history of our nation, as they were the first people to live on Canada. They have played a significant role in the shape of our nation, although, however, there are a few significant historical legacies. The First Nations people had all of North America to themselves before European settlers came and took land. The landmass we now know as Canada was all of their land. Many of the rights of First Nations people were stripped, like in 1870 when the first residential schools were formed. These residential schools were formed to convert First Nations from their old ways of living and traditions to a more European way of living. This mistake was not properly apologized for until 2008, when Prime Minister Stephen Harper publicly declared a formal apology, over 135 years later. This example of colonization can be seen throughout many examples in Canadian history. It may not be our most proud history, but it is essential that we acknowledge it nonetheless, so we do not repeat our mistakes. The history of Canada is essential to all citizens in Canada. The heritage of the land is reflected in many of the landmarks and communities all around the country. Canada itself comes from the Iroquois word Canada, meaning village or settlement. The name of the country that we call home is a testament to the very role First Nations have played in Canada's history. Throughout Canadian history, First Nations people have fought with us. During the War of 1812, First Nations warriors and Métis fighters fought alongside British troops and Canadian settler militia in the defense of these territories against invading American forces. Thousands of First Nations warriors and Métis fighters were in the battle, and more than 10,000 First Nations warriors from the St. Lawrence Valley and the Great Lakes region participated in nearly all major battles. During the First World War, thousands of Aboriginal people from all across Canada voluntarily enlisted in the Canadian military. They served in every major theater of the war and participated in nearly every major battle in which Canadian troops fought. Hundreds were wounded or lost their lives on foreign battlefields. Aboriginal soldiers served valiantly, many distinguishing themselves as capable and talented soldiers. At least 50 were awarded medals for bravery and heroism. During World War II, many First Nations soldiers were stripped of their status. This was due to the Indian Act, stating that after 4 years off the reserve, any First Nations person would lose their status. These soldiers voluntarily enlisted and served in our military, returning to Canada void of their rights. They voluntarily gave up these rights to serve in our nation through the Canadian Army, Navy, and Air Force, which are all rich components in Canada's heritage, a heritage we owe in part to the First Nations people who fought alongside Canadian soldiers for the very land that was taken from them. Lacrosse was a very important part in First Nations communities. Lacrosse was not only a sport played recreationally, but as a way to settle disputes over land, territories, and other tribal matters. Lacrosse was also used as a way to toughen young warriors. The sport of lacrosse was mainly played amongst the eastern Canadian nations, although it may have been played elsewhere. The Iroquois nation needed this sport to hold together the 6 Iroquois tribes because they needed a way to settle matters over land and other important matters without causing tribal wars. Lacrosse is now a heavily Europeanized or modernized version of the First Nations original game, and it is now a widespread and reputable sport. Lacrosse is one of Canada's 2 national sports and is competitively played all throughout North America and mostly around the world, though most commonly found in Canada and the United States. As I come to a close, I would like to reaffirm that the role the First Nations people have played in Canada's heritage is so substantial that it is immeasurable. From the role that Indigenous people have played into our armed forces, or how they brought joy into our lives such as lacrosse. Their impact is now more than ever visible through their resiliency to bring light to the truth of the history of Canada as we walk towards reconciliation. Thank you.